Imagine stepping outside your door tomorrow morning, and with just one glance at the color of your coat, strangers could instantly know your social standing, your wealth, even your moral character, and that judgment could either open doors of opportunity or slam them shut forever. In the Middle Ages, that was everyday reality. Your cloak was more than just fabric to keep you warm. It was a walking billboard of your identity, a silent declaration of who you were, who you aspired to be, and the risks you were willing to take in a world governed by strict, often brutal, social codes. A deep purple could mark you as royalty, a divine ruler chosen by God, while the wrong shade of yellow might brand you an outcast, a traitor to be shunned or worse. This was a time when color was power, and that power came with immense rewards and terrifying consequences. In this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on this vibrant and perilous world. We'll explore how something as simple as the dye in your cloak could crown you with respect and privilege, or doom you to persecution and ruin. We'll unravel the complex web of sumptuary laws, actual legal statutes that dictated what colors each social class could and couldn't wear, and delve into the superstitions and beliefs that gave each hue its weight. From the sacred purples reserved for emperors to the humble browns of the peasantry, every color had a story, a set of rules, and a hidden meaning that shaped lives in ways we can scarcely imagine today. You'll discover how these ancient choices still whisper in our modern world, influencing everything from the colors we wear at weddings to the symbols we use in branding and ceremony. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into the psychology of symbolism, a look at how societies use visual language to control, to inspire, and to communicate across centuries. So settle in and open your mind, because we're about to see the past and perhaps even the present in a completely new light, where every thread and every shade tells a tale of human ambition, fear, and the eternal desire to be seen. Think about the last time you chose an outfit for an important event. You probably considered the impression you wanted to make, maybe even the message you wanted to send. Now imagine that your choice wasn't just about style, but about survival. In the Middle Ages, the color of your clothing was a direct reflection of your place in a rigid social hierarchy, a hierarchy enforced by law, religion, and centuries of tradition. This was a world where your identity was worn on your sleeve, quite literally, and getting it wrong could have dire consequences. The very fabric of society was woven with threads of meaning, where a single hue could signal divine right, immense wealth, or dangerous ambition. This complex language of color wasn't arbitrary. It was built on a foundation of incredibly difficult and expensive craftsmanship. Creating a vibrant, lasting dye was a monumental task. That rich scarlet red came from thousands of tiny kermes insects, painstakingly collected and processed. That deep, regal purple required the harvested glands of countless murex snails, a process so noxious and labor-intensive that its cost was legendary. Because these colors were so hard to produce, they became instant symbols of affluence and power. Only the elite could afford them, and they made sure to keep it that way through strict regulations known as sumptuary laws. These laws were designed to make the social order visible at a glance. A merchant might be wealthier than a poor knight, but the law forbade him from wearing the same colors, ensuring that everyone stayed in their God-ordained place. So a cloak was far more than a piece of clothing. It was a public declaration. Wearing the right color could gain you respect, open doors, and affirm your status. But wearing the wrong color could mark you as an arrogant upstart, a blasphemer, or a criminal, inviting scorn, fines, or even imprisonment. This intricate code turned every public appearance into a carefully calculated performance, a navigation of symbols where the stakes were incredibly high. Understanding this system is the first step to seeing the medieval world as its people did, not in muted grays and browns, but in a vibrant, dangerous, and deeply meaningful spectrum of color. But these rules went far beyond simple fashion police. Sumptuary laws were a comprehensive system of social control, meticulously designed to make the entire class structure visible and undeniable at a single glance. Imagine a world without ID or official titles where your clothing was your primary form of identification. The laws were astonishingly specific. They didn't just say, "No purple for peasants." They detailed exactly which shades, which fabrics, and even which types of fur were permitted for each rung on the social ladder. A law in 13th century Spain might forbid a merchant from wearing sable fur, while a statute in Renaissance Venice could specify the maximum width of a gold trim on a non-noble sleeve. This granular control extended to the very thread count and the number of buttons, creating a visual language so precise that anyone could be instantly categorized. The reasoning behind this was twofold. On the surface, it was about maintaining order and preventing the sin of vanity, but beneath that, it was a powerful economic tool. By restricting the use of expensive imported fabrics like silk and velvet and rare dyes like true scarlet, the nobility protected their own markets and ensured that wealth flowed to approved industries. It was also a psychological tool, a constant, visible reminder that no matter how much money a wealthy banker or successful merchant might accumulate, they would never truly be considered equal to someone born into the aristocratic class. Their success could buy them comfort, but it could not buy them the right to look like their social superiors. This created a society where ambition was visually stifled, where your aspirations were literally hemmed in by law. The penalty for breaking these rules was severe and meant to be a public deterrent. You wouldn't just get a fine, you could have the offending garment confiscated and burned right in front of you. You could be paraded through the streets as an example of arrogance. In some cases, repeated offenses could lead to imprisonment or even harsher punishments. This wasn't a minor infraction, it was seen as a direct challenge to the divine order itself, an act of rebellion against God and King. So when a person chose a cloak, they weren't just choosing a color. They were navigating a complex legal and social minefield, making a calculated decision about how much risk they were willing to take for a moment of perceived prestige. And of all the colors that could elevate or destroy a person, none held more power, more mystique, or more danger than royal purple. To even glimpse this color was to witness a kind of earthly divinity, a visual representation of a power that claimed its authority directly from God. Its story begins long before the medieval period, in the ancient Phoenician city of Tyre, where a legendary dye was discovered. This wasn't a dye made from common plants. It was a substance so rare and so difficult to produce that its value was literally worth more than its weight in gold. The process involved harvesting thousands upon thousands of murex sea snails. These were not large creatures. It could take a staggering 12,000 snails just to yield a single gram of the pure dye. The mollusks were cracked open to extract a tiny gland, which was then left to rot in the sun in vast, putrid vats. The resulting smell was said to be so overwhelmingly foul that the dye workshops had to be located downwind of the cities. But from this process of decay and stench emerged the most beautiful, deep, and color-fast purple the world had ever seen. It was a color that did not fade in sunlight but grew richer and more vibrant with age, a quality that only added to its mythical status. This Tyrian purple, as it became known, was the foundation of its power. The sheer, unbelievable cost of its production meant that from its very inception, it was the exclusive property of the ultra-wealthy and the ultra-powerful. The Roman Empire codified this exclusivity into law. Emperors wore togas of solid purple, and high-ranking senators were permitted togas with a single purple stripe, a visible reminder of their place in the hierarchy. This tradition was seamlessly inherited by the Byzantine Empire, which saw itself as the direct continuation of Rome. In Constantinople, the imperial connection to purple became even more intense. The emperor was not just a political leader, he was God's representative on earth, and purple was the color of that divine right. The very palace complex contained a chamber known as the Porphyra, a room lined with porphyry, a rare purple-veined marble where empresses would give birth. These children were known as porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, a title that set them apart and legitimized their claim to the throne in a way no other could. To wear this color without explicit permission was therefore more than a fashion crime. It was an act of lèse-majesté, a direct challenge to the monarch's authority, and by extension, a challenge to the divine order of the universe itself. It was the visual equivalent of claiming the throne for yourself. The consequences for such audacity were predictably severe and meant to serve as a stark warning to all. While fines or imprisonment were common for breaking other sumptuary laws, a commoner or even a lower-ranking noble court wearing true purple could face charges of treason. The punishment was often execution or permanent exile, a literal removal from society for the crime of visually pretending to be something you were not. This created an almost magical aura around the color. A purple cloak wasn't just a garment, it was a crown woven from thread, a scepter made of fabric. It commanded instant reverence and fear. For the person legally permitted to wear it, it was the ultimate crown, a symbol of unassailable authority that separated them from all of humanity. For anyone else, it was a guaranteed path to doom, a temptation so dangerous that even possessing the dyed fabric could be a death sentence. This is why purple remains, even today, the undisputed color of royalty. Now imagine a color that captures the very essence of fire, blood, and life itself, a shade so intense it could not be ignored. This was the power of scarlet red in the medieval world, a hue that commanded attention and respect, but one that came with a complex and often dangerous set of rules. While purple was the undisputed color of emperors, scarlet was the signature of power for those who ruled the earthly realms of commerce, church, and court. Its brilliance was a direct declaration of wealth because achieving that specific, vibrant red was an incredibly costly and labor-intensive process. The premier dye, known as kermes, was derived not from a plant, but from the dried bodies of tiny female insects, kermes vermilio, which were painstakingly harvested from the branches of oak trees primarily in the Mediterranean. It took a staggering number of these insects, tens of thousands, to produce just a single pound of dye, making the resulting fabric astronomically expensive. This meant that a cloak of true scarlet was a billboard of affluence. For the rising class of wealthy merchants and bankers, it was a way to visually assert their financial success, even if their bloodlines weren't noble. For high-ranking clergy, it symbolized the blood of Christ and the fiery passion of the Holy Spirit, adorning cardinals and princes of the church. And for the nobility, it was a mark of vitality, courage, and martial prowess. But this visibility was a double-edged sword. Because scarlet was so desirable, it became a primary target of sumptuary laws. Legislators were determined to prevent the newly moneyed classes from blurring the lines of the social order. A statute might declare that only those with a certain annual income or a knightly title could wear scarlet cloth of a particular quality. For a wealthy merchant to flout this law was not just a minor act of vanity, it was seen as a brazen challenge to the entire feudal structure. It screamed of social climbing and arrogant ambition, inviting not just fines but also social scorn and potentially dangerous envy from those above him. The color's symbolism further complicated its use. Yes, it represented life and vitality, but it also evoked blood, both the sacred blood of martyrs and the violent blood of battle and mortality. It was the color of passion, encompassing both divine love and earthly, sinful lust. This duality meant that the same scarlet robe that signified a cardinal's holy office could, on a different person, be interpreted as a sign of debauchery or pride. This connection to sin was made explicit in certain professions that were forced to wear red as a mark of infamy. In some European cities, executioners were required to wear a red hood or cloak, visually setting them apart as a figure of death and permanent bloodshed. Similarly, prostitutes in many regions were mandated by law to incorporate a red item of clothing, like a ribbon or a hood, to mark their trade and ensure they were easily identifiable. This practice, intended to regulate and shame, added a powerful layer of social stigma to the color. So, when a person of middling status chose to wear a scarlet cloak, they were playing a perilous game of perception. Were they a respectable, pious merchant displaying their God-given prosperity? Or were they an arrogant social climber, a vain individual, or someone associated with the world's oldest profession? The interpretation lay entirely in the eye of the beholder, and that beholder could be a rival, a tax collector, or a nobleman quick to take offense. A successful display could elevate one's standing, commanding immediate respect in a crowded marketplace or at a public gathering. A misstep, however, could lead to financial penalty, public humiliation, or even violence. The story of Scarlet Red is perhaps the best example of the high-stakes sartorial theater of the Middle Ages, where a single, beautiful color could be both a crown of success and a target on your back. But if purple and red were the established heavyweights of the medieval color spectrum, then blue is the ultimate underdog story. Its journey from near invisibility to a position of supreme prestige is one of the most fascinating transformations in the history of color. In the early Middle Ages, blue simply wasn't a major player in the visual language of power. The ancient Romans had associated it with barbarism, and it held little religious or royal significance. What changed? It began with accessibility. For the common person, blue was one of the easier colors to achieve. The leaves of the woad plant could be fermented in vats of human urine to create a serviceable, if somewhat dull and often smelly, blue dye. This made it a staple for peasants and laborers, a practical color for blending into the background of daily life. The turning point arrived from two completely different directions, one technological and one theological. The technological revolution came in the form of a stone. Traders began importing lapis lazuli, a breathtakingly vivid blue semi-precious stone, from mines in a single remote region of Afghanistan. The journey was so long and perilous that by the time it reached Europe, it was more valuable than gold. Artists discovered they could grind this stone into a powder to create a pigment of unparalleled depth and brilliance, a color they called ultramarine, literally, beyond the sea. This was a blue that seemed to hold light within itself, a celestial, radiant hue that was instantly and incredibly expensive. Its use was initially reserved for the most important figures in religious art, specifically for the robes of the Virgin Mary. This is where the theological shift occurred. Before the 12th century, Mary was often depicted in somber, dark robes, but as devotion to her grew, theologians began to emphasize her role as the Queen of Heaven. What better way to visualize her heavenly majesty than with the most costly color on earth? the use of ultramarine blue for her mantle transformed her image into one of divine royalty and compassion. This association between the Virgin Mary and this specific, radiant blue fundamentally altered Europe's perception of the color itself. It was no longer the color of peasant smocks. It was now the color of the Mother of God, imbued with qualities of piety, humility, and divine grace. The French monarchy, deeply devoted to Mary, quickly adopted this rich blue as a royal color, incorporating it into their coats of arms and court fashions. This created a new and complex social landscape for the color blue. Suddenly, everyone wanted it, but not all blues were created equal. The wealthy and noble could afford fabrics dyed with refined woad or, for the very richest, imports like indigo, achieving deep, saturated shades known as cloth of blue. The poor were still stuck with their pale, washed-out woad. Sumptuary laws soon followed to manage this new desire. A law might decree that only the nobility could wear certain deep shades of blue or could use blue velvet or silk. This meant that wearing blue became a nuanced social signal. A knight wearing a rich, deep blue cloak was simply displaying his rightful status, but a wealthy merchant wearing that same shade was making a bold and potentially illegal statement. He was visually claiming a level of prestige that his birth did not afford him, wrapping himself in the mantle of the aristocracy and, by extension, the Virgin herself. It could be seen as an act of profound arrogance. Conversely, a nobleman caught wearing a pale, common blue might be mocked for appearing impoverished or for not upholding the visual standards of his class. The color blue, therefore, became a tightrope. It offered the opportunity to align oneself with divine virtue and royal power, but it demanded a precise understanding of shade, fabric, and social context. Getting it right could bestow an aura of piety and nobility. Getting it wrong could lead to accusations of pretension, hypocrisy, or even blasphemy, proving that even the most heavenly of colors had its risks down here on Earth. Yet for all its connections to life and the hunt, green held a deep and unsettling duality. It was the color of the unpredictable, untamable wild, the deep, shadowy forest where familiar paths vanished and the rules of civilized society no longer applied. This association bred a powerful undercurrent of superstition. In the folklore of the British Isles and much of Northern Europe, green was inextricably linked to the otherworld, the realm of fairies, elves, and spirits. These were not the cute, winged creatures of modern cartoons. They were capricious, powerful, and often malicious beings who resented human intrusion. To wear green, especially in a forest, was believed to be an act of incredible risk. You might be mistaken for one of them, inviting their attention, or you might be seen as arrogantly invading their domain, provoking their mischief or wrath. It was commonly said that travelers should avoid wearing green on a journey lest they attract bad luck or find themselves led astray by will-o'-the-wisps into treacherous bogs. This belief was so pervasive that in some regions green was considered an unlucky color for weddings, as it might invite envy from the fairy folk and curse the marriage. This supernatural stigma added a layer of profound psychological danger to the color, a fear that went far beyond breaking human laws. This sense of danger was compounded by the color's moral and physical associations. Within the framework of Christian morality, green's link to nature could easily slide into connotations of worldly temptation and sin. It became the color of envy, one of the 7 deadly sins, and was sometimes used in art to depict deceit or treachery. Perhaps most frighteningly, the color could pose a literal, physical threat to the wearer. Achieving a vibrant, lasting green dye was notoriously difficult. Dyers often had to layer yellow and blue dyes, which could produce inconsistent results. One of the most common methods for creating a bright green involved using verdigris, a pigment made by exposing copper to acetic acid from vinegar or urine. While this created a beautiful emerald hue, the copper salts in the dye were highly toxic and corrosive. A green garment dyed with verdigris could literally poison the wearer through skin contact, especially if it became damp with sweat or rain, causing sores, nausea, and other ailments. There are even accounts from the time suggesting that finely dressed courtiers might have been slowly poisoned by their own magnificent green robes. This tangible, physical peril transformed the color from a mere symbol of misfortune into an active agent of it. A beautiful green cloak might not just attract evil spirits, it might itself be a vessel of bodily harm. So, when a medieval person chose to wear green, they were making a deeply complex statement fraught with potential misinterpretation. A forester in a practical green tunic was simply dressed for his work. A young woman in a green kirtle might be celebrating spring and youth, but a courtier in a lavish emerald velvet cloak was walking a very fine line. Were they displaying a connection to the natural world and their own vitality, or were they inadvertently invoking envy, attracting ill fortune, or even slowly poisoning themselves? In a world governed by visible signals, green was perhaps the most ambiguous and unpredictable hue of all, a crown of life and a potential shroud of misfortune, all woven into the same precarious thread. While purple screamed of divine authority and scarlet shouted of wealth, the color black spoke in a far more complex and nuanced whisper. It was a shade of profound contradiction, capable of signaling both the humblest piety and the most formidable worldly power, often within the very same garment. For much of the early medieval period, achieving a true, deep, and color-fast black was incredibly difficult. Most black clothing was actually a very dark brown or gray, the result of undyed wool or simple, inexpensive dyes like iron oxide or oak galls. This practical limitation meant that dark, somber colors were naturally associated with the poor and with those who had renounced worldly vanity. Monks and nuns adopted black or dark gray habits as a direct symbol of their humility, poverty, and rejection of the material world. Their clothing was a uniform of devotion, visually separating them from the temptations of secular life and marking them as servants of God. Similarly, penitents might don dark, coarse robes as an outward sign of their atonement for sins, a public display of their inner remorse and commitment to a more spiritual path. This all began to change thanks to a technological revolution in dyeing. By the late Middle Ages, dyers, particularly in the wealthy commercial centers of Italy and Flanders, had perfected techniques using multiple dyes, often a base of woad blue overdyed with a madder red or a yellow, to create a rich, deep, and lasting black. This new, intense black was not the color of poverty. It was astonishingly expensive and difficult to produce. It required skill, time, and costly materials, instantly transforming it from a shade of humility into a potent symbol of immense wealth and sophisticated taste. This is where the meaning of black dramatically split. A new class of powerful individuals, particularly the rising merchant elites and certain ambitious nobles, seized upon this new black. They saw in it a way to display their affluence without resorting to the bright, regulated colors of the traditional aristocracy. Wearing expensive black became a statement of sober, serious power. It said, "I am so wealthy and confident that I do not need to wear gaudy colors to prove it." No one embodied this shift more powerfully than Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. In the 15th century, after the assassination of his father, Philip plunged his entire court into mourning black, but he never really came out of it. He made deep, luxurious black the official color of his court, creating a style that was imitated across Europe. His black velvets and silks were not the rough cloth of a monk. They were exquisite, finely tailored, and often trimmed with priceless jewels and gold. This was black as a crown of a different sort, a crown of control, austerity, and formidable political ambition. This duality meant that navigating the social signals of a black cloak was a delicate art. The same color could be interpreted in wildly different ways based on its quality, its context, and the status of the wearer. A finely dressed merchant in a sleek black gown might be seen as a serious, trustworthy man of business. But if he were perceived as overly proud, that same garment could attract accusations of hypocrisy, a man pretending to a monk's humility while flaunting his wealth. A nobleman like Philip used black to project authority, but a lesser noble might be suspected of mourning a lost fortune or simply lacking the vibrancy expected of his station. And always lingering in the background were the older, more primal associations of black with death, mourning, and the unknown. To choose black was to embrace this entire spectrum of meaning, from the sacred to the profane, from the humility of the cloister to the calculating ambition of the court. It was a color that demanded the world to pause and look closer, to decipher the intricate message being woven by the person who dared to wear it. In a world dominated by the deep, saturated hues of power and piety, white stood apart as a color of brilliant light and profound paradox. It was the shade of absolute purity, of untouched snow and divine radiance, a visual representation of innocence and spiritual perfection. This made it the unquestioned color for the most sacred moments and roles in medieval life. Priests wore white linen albs during Mass to signify their ritual cleanliness and connection to God. A knight would often wear a white tunic over his armor or a white cloak to proclaim his chivalric virtues and pure intentions. And most famously, brides, particularly among the aristocracy, began the tradition of wearing white to symbolize their virginity and the sanctity of the marriage vow, a custom that has endured for centuries. To don white was to make a public declaration of moral and spiritual integrity, to wrap oneself in a mantle of virtue that was recognized by all. Yet, this pristine symbolism came with an immense practical burden that immediately separated the aspirational from the truly powerful. Keeping a garment of flawless, brilliant white in the Middle Ages was a Herculean task. This was an era before modern bleach and washing machines. Laundering was a brutal process involving harsh lye soaps, pounding with bats, and scrubbing on stones in rivers, a process that could quickly yellow and wear out delicate fabrics. A simple grass stain, a splash of mud, or even just persistent dust could ruin the effect entirely. Therefore, a consistently clean white garment was not just a symbol of purity, it was a blatant advertisement of wealth and status. It meant you could afford to own multiple sets of clothing, that you had servants to undertake the arduous labor of maintenance, and that your life was not one of manual labor in dirty fields or grimy workshops. A flawless white cloak was a crown of privilege, proclaiming that its wearer existed above the messiness of everyday life. This practical reality meant that the choice to wear white was always a calculated risk. For a noblewoman at court, it was an expected display of her family's refinement. For a wealthy merchant's wife, it might be a bold and potentially resented imitation of that aristocratic luxury. For a commoner, it was almost unthinkable. To attempt it would be seen as the height of foolish vanity, a sure sign that you did not know your place and were wasting precious resources on an impractical fantasy. The color could therefore easily tip from a symbol of righteousness into one of arrogant overreach. This duality extended beyond fashion into the realms of war and politics. On the battlefield, a white flag was universally recognized as a signal of surrender or a desire to parley, a use of the color's peaceful connotations to save lives. But in times of revolt, this same symbolism could be powerfully subverted. During peasant rebellions, leaders sometimes instructed their followers to wear white badges or armbands. This was a genius piece of political theater. It framed their violent uprising not as a chaotic riot, but as a righteous crusade, a pure and holy struggle against corruption and oppression. They were visually claiming the moral high ground, outfitting themselves in the color of legitimacy to counter their opponents' claims that they were merely lawless rabble. So, a white cloak in the medieval world was never a simple or neutral choice. It was a garment loaded with multiple, competing meanings. It could be a sanctified uniform, a luxurious display of idle wealth, a marker of foolish impracticality, or a bold banner of revolution. The same color that adorned a queen on her wedding day could be flown as a flag of truce by a defeated general or tied to the arm of a rebel fighting for his life. To choose white was to invite the world to judge your character, your motives, and your station, all based on a shade that was deceptively simple yet impossibly difficult to master. Yet for all its golden brilliance, yellow was a color that cast a long and ominous shadow across medieval society, a hue so deeply divided in its meaning that wearing it was like walking a razor's edge. On one hand, it was the color of life itself, the radiant glow of the sun, the precious shimmer of gold, the vibrant bloom of spring flowers. It spoke of warmth, happiness, and divine light, a symbol of optimism and vitality that could lift the spirits on the darkest of days. For those who could afford it, a specific, luminous yellow became a stunning display of wealth. This was achieved with saffron, a spice derived from the delicate stigmas of the crocus flower. It took over 70,000 flowers to produce a single pound of this dye, making saffron yellow cloth more expensive by weight than gold itself. To wear a cloak of this radiant hue was to proclaim your immense fortune to the world, to literally wrap yourself in sunlight and prosperity. It was a crown woven from the most precious of threads. But this golden light had a very dark twin. In the moral and religious imagination of the time, yellow was also the color of treachery, jealousy, and deceit. It was associated with Judas Iscariot, who was increasingly depicted in art wearing yellow robes, visually branding him as the ultimate betrayer. This connection to sin and duplicity made the color morally suspect. This negative symbolism was then weaponized by those in power and turned into a tool of brutal social control. Across Europe, various laws and decrees mandated that certain marginalized groups be marked with yellow. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 ordered Jews and Muslims to distinguish themselves in their dress from Christians, and yellow badges or pointed yellow hats, known as Judan hut, became the most common enforcement of this rule. Heretics and lepers were also often forced to wear yellow patches or crosses on their clothing. This was not a fashion choice. It was a deliberate act of othering, a visual brand that transformed a person into a target. That splash of yellow on a sleeve or hat instantly identified someone as an outsider, making them vulnerable to harassment, violence, and legal discrimination. It was a color of doom, an officially sanctioned signal for persecution that could follow a person and their family for generations. This created an impossible tension for anyone considering the color. For a Christian noblewoman, a saffron-dyed veil might be a breathtaking display of her family's status, a perfectly acceptable use of a costly import. But she would always be aware of its other, uglier connotations, where someone might mistake her vibrant accessory for a symbol of vanity or even moral laxity. For a wealthy Jewish merchant, however, the calculation was infinitely more dangerous. His faith already mandated that he might be forced to wear a yellow circle on his cloak. To then choose to wear any other yellow garment could be seen as an act of profound defiance or reckless pride, potentially inviting even greater scrutiny and danger from a hostile population. Conversely, to avoid the color entirely was to accept the stigma imposed upon him. This is what made yellow so perilous. Its meaning was not fixed. It was a mirror that reflected the prejudices and power dynamics of the viewer. A single yellow cloak could be a crown of gold on one person and a mark of Cain on another, all within the same city street. It was a color that demanded not just an understanding of fashion, but a survivalist's knowledge of law, theology, and social hatred. To wear yellow was to make a statement, whether you intended to or not, and in the volatile world of the Middle Ages, that statement could either be a declaration of wealth or a sentence of exile. While the nobility and wealthy merchants wrapped themselves in the brilliant, symbolic hues of power and piety, the vast majority of the medieval population lived their lives in a world painted with a far more practical and muted palette. For the peasant, the serf, the everyday laborer, and the common artisan, the colors of daily existence were the earthy, undemanding tones of gray and brown. These were not colors chosen for their symbolic weight or to make a statement. They were the colors of necessity, of function, and of blending in. Achieving these shades required no expensive imports or complex chemical processes. They were coaxed from the very landscape these people worked. Wool from their sheep was often used in its natural, undyed state, which could range from a deep, smoky brown to a soft, fleecy gray. When a bit of color was desired, it came from foraged materials. Walnut hulls created rich browns, onion skins yielded a rusty tan, and the bark of alder trees could produce a serviceable, dull black. These dyes were affordable, accessible, and most importantly, they were durable, meant to withstand the grinding labor of life in the fields, the workshops, and the dusty streets. This practical origin story imbued gray and brown with a powerful social meaning. They became the universal uniform of the lower classes, a visual shorthand for humility, hard work, and a life lived close to the soil. In a society obsessed with visual hierarchy, these colors rendered a person almost invisible, marking them as part of the anonymous, toiling mass that formed the economic foundation of the feudal world. There were no sumptuary laws governing gray and brown precisely because the elite had no desire to wear them. For the nobility, to be seen in such hues would have been a social embarrassment, a visual confession of poverty or failure. For the commoner, however, this lack of restriction was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offered a kind of freedom, the freedom from the anxiety of breaking expensive fashion laws. A peasant could never be fined for wearing the wrong shade of brown, but on the other hand, this sartorial liberty was really an illusion, a freedom born from a lack of choice. Wearing these colors constantly reinforced one's place at the bottom of the social ladder, a daily, visual reminder of a station in life that was nearly impossible to escape. Yet, this very quality of invisibility could be strategically weaponized by those who wore it. In times of peace and stability, blending into the background could be a form of protection. A person dressed in humble browns was less likely to attract the unwanted attention of tax collectors, recruiting officers for a lord's army, or even thieves. It was a cloak of anonymity that could shield a family from scrutiny and allow them to navigate their difficult lives with a measure of safety. But this protective camouflage became even more valuable in times of unrest. During peasant revolts or periods of civil strife, the ability to disappear was a critical survival skill. A rebel fleeing from authorities could shed any distinctive clothing and simply pull on a common brown tunic, instantly melting into the crowd of other laborers. The same colors that marked them as powerless could, in the right moment, become their greatest asset, granting them a mobility and anonymity that a brightly dressed noble could never achieve. For the ambitious individual, however, someone with dreams of climbing the social ladder even just a single rung, gray and brown were colors to be actively avoided. A successful merchant or a skilled guildsman who had accumulated some wealth would make a conscious effort to incorporate even small amounts of color into his or her family's wardrobe: a blue headscarf, a red trim on a sleeve, a green apron. This was a deliberate and calculated act of social distancing. It was a way of visually saying, "I am not one of them anymore. My life is not solely defined by manual labor." To continue wearing the drab hues of the peasantry was to remain visually, and therefore socially, anchored to a class they were trying to leave behind. The story of gray and brown, then, is not a simple tale of poverty. It is a complex narrative about the politics of visibility. These were the colors of both constraint and cunning, of social limitation and strategic anonymity. They offered a form of safety through obscurity, but demanded the price of perpetual social deference, proving that even the most humble of colors played a profound role in shaping a medieval person's destiny. But the language of medieval fashion wasn't limited to single, powerful statements. It possessed a complex grammar of its own, a syntax of stripes, checks, and elaborate patterns that could convey messages far more intricate than any solid hue. A nobleman didn't just wear red. He might wear a cloak divided vertically into brilliant red and deep azure blue, a style known as party-colored. This striking fashion, where each half of a garment was a different color, was wildly popular among the elite in the High Middle Ages. It was a bold, unmistakable declaration of wealth, as it essentially meant paying for two separate, expensive dye jobs for a single item of clothing. However, this flamboyant style wasn't exclusive to the nobility. Court jesters and entertainers also adopted party-colored outfits. Their mismatched hues meant to visually signal their role as figures of fun and satire, existing outside the normal social rules. This created a fascinating and dangerous ambiguity. For a noble, party color was a crown of excess. For a commoner to mimic it, however, was to risk being seen as a ridiculous upstart or, worse, to be mistaken for a fool in the literal sense. Sumptuary laws quickly moved to clarify this confusion, often explicitly reserving the most extravagant patterns and fabric combinations for the aristocracy to prevent this blurring of visual lines. This concept of coded patterns reached its most sophisticated form in the system of heraldry. A knight clad in full plate armor was an anonymous, metallic figure on the battlefield. His identity, his allegiance, and his very lineage were displayed not on a solid-colored cloak, but on the intricate design painted on his shield and embroidered on his surcoat, his coat of arms. Heraldry was a complete visual language with its own strict rules, and color was its most vital component. Each hue, or tincture, carried a specific meaning known as the meaning of colors tradition. Gold or ore represented generosity and elevation of the mind. Silver, argent, signified peace and sincerity. Red, gules, stood for warrior-like courage and magnanimity. Blue, azure, denoted loyalty and truth, while green, vert, could indicate joy and love. A heraldic design combining these colors and symbols into a unique pattern was a legally protected form of identity, a kind of medieval trademark passed down through generations. To wear another family's arms or to incorporate elements you had no right to was considered a grave offense called heraldic usurpation. It was more than just fashion theft. It was a form of identity fraud that could lead to violent disputes, as it implied a false claim to lands, titles, and a noble bloodline you did not possess. Beyond the battlefield, these patterned signals were everywhere. The specific stripes on a merchant's tunic could indicate his membership in a particular guild. The checkered pattern on a servant's livery instantly identified which great household they served, turning them into a walking advertisement for their lord's power and influence. Even the humble pilgrim could be identified by the specific pattern of shells sewn onto their hat, detailing which sacred site they had visited. This added a layer of immense complexity to the already risky business of getting dressed. It wasn't enough to simply choose a permitted color. One had to ensure that the pattern, the combination, and the overall design were also socially and legally appropriate for their station. A cloak with an unauthorized striped pattern or an overly elaborate embroidered border could be just as damning as wearing imperial purple. In times of war or political instability, these visual codes became matters of life and death. Wearing the crest of a rival faction could get you killed by your own side, while displaying the pattern of an allied lord could grant you safe passage. The medieval wardrobe was a tapestry of meaning, where every thread, every color block, and every symbol was a carefully chosen word in a silent but powerfully eloquent conversation about who you were, where you belonged, and the alliances you kept. But just as a word can change its meaning when spoken in a different country, the language of color was not spoken the same way across all of medieval Europe. A traveler setting out from London with a perfectly acceptable green cloak could find themselves in a world of trouble by the time they reached the forests of Germany, not because of any law they broke, but because of the deep-seated local superstitions they unknowingly offended. The symbolism of a hue was never set in stone. It was shaped by the unique cultural, religious, and economic landscape of each region, creating a complex and often contradictory map of meaning that a savvy medieval person had to navigate. Consider the color green. In the Christian kingdoms of Northern Europe, as we've discussed, it was often tinged with an air of mystery and danger, linked to fairy folk and the unpredictable wilds. But if that same traveler journeyed south into Al-Andalus, the Islamic-controlled regions of Spain, they would encounter a completely different reality. Here, green was revered as a sacred color, intimately associated with the paradise promised in the Quran. It was said to be the favorite color of the Prophet Muhammad, and it adorned the banners of the caliphs and the domes of magnificent mosques. To wear a green cloak here was not to risk fairy mischief. It was to potentially align oneself with divine favor and high cultural sophistication. The meaning flipped entirely based on the dominant faith and its artistic traditions. This religious divide created invisible borders far more powerful than any wall. A Christian pilgrim traveling through a Muslim-held territory, or a Muslim merchant trading in a Christian port city, had to be acutely aware of these differences. Wearing a color that was sacred to your host could be a sign of respect, but wearing one that was stigmatized by them could be a fatal mistake, turning a simple garment into a provocation. Blue tells a similar story of regional evolution. Its journey from a common utility color to a noble hue happened at different times and for different reasons depending on where you were. In England, for a long time, blue remained the color of servitude, commonly worn by laborers and peasants who used readily available woad. But just across the Channel in France, a perfect storm of technology and theology was elevating blue to unprecedented heights. The development of finer dyeing techniques with woad, particularly in the Toulouse region, produced a richer, more desirable shade. But the true game-changer was the fervent devotion to the Virgin Mary that swept through France in the 12th and 13th centuries. As the great cathedrals like Chartres and Notre Dame rose, their stained glass windows flooded the interiors with a celestial, divine blue, forever linking the color to the Queen of Heaven. The French monarchy, deeply entwined with the Church, adopted this Marian blue into their own heraldry. This regional fervor meant that a deep, rich blue cloak in Paris was a symbol of piety and royal connection, while that same cloak in a rural English village might still mark you as a commoner. A French nobleman visiting the English court in a splendid blue surcoat might be confused why he wasn't receiving the same level of instant reverence his attire would command back home. These regional variations were also dictated by pure economics, the availability of local dye materials. If you lived in a region where a certain plant flourished or a specific trade route terminated, the color it produced could become a local specialty, changing its cultural weight. The city of Lincoln in England, for instance, was famous for producing a fine green cloth, known as Lincoln green, which became associated with the local weaving industry, and even later with the legendary outlaw Robin Hood. In Italy, the city of Venice grew immensely wealthy by controlling the trade in luxurious dyes and fabrics from the East, meaning a Venetian merchant had access to a palette of colors that was simply unavailable or prohibitively expensive in landlocked regions of Germany. This meant that a color common and inexpensive in one town could be a rare and costly luxury just 100 miles away, instantly altering the social signal it sent. A merchant traveling with a caravan of goods had to be a part-time anthropologist, understanding not just what would sell, but what meaning his wares would carry in each new market. A bolt of vibrant scarlet cloth might be a guaranteed success in a wealthy Flemish trading city, but could it be seen as arrogant or even illegal in a more conservative, sumptuary law-strict town further inland? The regional landscape of color was thus a patchwork of faith, folklore, and commerce, where the only constant was change. For anyone moving through the medieval world, their cloak was more than just clothing. It was a passport that needed to be stamped with the correct local meaning at every stop, a continuous performance of identity that required immense cultural literacy to navigate successfully. Behind every thread of royal purple or flash of scarlet red lay an entire hidden economy, a global network of harvest, trade, and staggering expense that made these colors as much a currency as a fashion statement. The value of a cloak was literally woven into its fibers, determined by the astronomical cost of the raw materials needed to create its hue. Take the legendary Tyrian purple. Its production was less a craft and more an industrial-scale operation of biological extraction. The Murex brandaris snail doesn't give up its secret easily. These creatures had to be harvested by divers from the seafloor or gathered from shallow waters, and then the tiny hypobranchial gland had to be meticulously cracked out of each individual shell. We're talking about a ratio that is almost unimaginable. To produce just a single gram of pure dye, artisans needed to process 12,000 snails. The glands were then left to putrefy in vast, sun-exposed vats, a process that produced such an overwhelmingly foul stench that ancient writers like Pliny the Elder noted that dye workshops were always located downwind of settlements. The sheer labor, the revolting smell, and the incredible volume of raw materials required meant that from its very origin, purple was worth more than its weight in gold. This wasn't just a color, it was a concentrated form of capital. This pattern repeated itself across the spectrum of prestigious hues. That brilliant, unwavering scarlet red, so beloved by nobility and cardinals, came from a similarly gruesome and painstaking source. The dye known as kermes was derived from the desiccated bodies of pregnant female scale insects, Kermes vermilio, which live on the kermes oak trees of the Mediterranean basin. Harvesting them was a delicate seasonal task. The tiny insects, which look like little berries, had to be carefully scraped from the branches, dried, and then crushed to release the potent red pigment within. The yield was just as pitifully small as with the murex snail. It took approximately 70,000 of these insects to yield just 1 pound of dye. This made kermes one of the most expensive commodities in the pre-modern world, a luxury item traded along routes as valuable as those for silk and spices. The control of these dye sources became a primary economic objective for entire cities and nations. The city of Venice grew fantastically wealthy, not just by trading goods, but by controlling the import and distribution of these precious colorants from the East. Other regions, like the area around Toulouse in France, built their entire wealth on the cultivation of the woad plant for blue dye, creating a powerful economic bloc known as the woad barons, who fiercely protected their monopoly and their profits. This fierce competition over dyes often spilled over from the economic realm into open conflict and espionage. Rival cities would impose tariffs on each other's dyed goods, and dyers' guilds protected their recipes with the secrecy of state intelligence, knowing that a single leaked formula could collapse an entire local industry. The quest for a competitive advantage even led to acts of industrial sabotage. There are accounts of merchants allegedly bribing laborers to spoil vats of a competitor's dye, or to smuggle contraband dye materials across borders in defiance of strict protectionist laws. For the individual wearer, this high-stakes economic reality had very personal consequences. Wearing a cloak of a truly expensive dye was a clear public declaration of your financial power. But it was also a risk. If you were a merchant's wife wearing a Kermes-dyed scarlet gown, you were effectively walking around with a year's worth of a peasant family's income on your back. This could invite not just admiration but also dangerous envy. More critically, if your social status didn't obviously match the financial statement your clothing was making, it could raise serious questions. How could a low-ranking knight or a minor guildsman afford such a luxury? The assumption might quickly turn to suspicion of corruption, embezzlement, or dealing in the black market. In a society without modern banking, your clothing was your financial portfolio, displayed for all to see. A color that was too rich for your station wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It could be seen as evidence of a crime, making the choice of a cloak a delicate calculation of economic display and personal safety. And woven through every thread of law, economy, and regional custom was the most powerful force of all: the profound influence of the Church. In the medieval mind, the physical world was a reflection of the divine, and color was a key part of that holy language, a visual theology that dictated meaning from the highest holy day to the most mundane personal choice. The liturgical calendar itself was a rotating spectrum of sacred hues, each color guiding the faithful through the emotional and spiritual journey of the year. Priests and bishops donned vestments of specific colors to mark these seasons: the penitential purple of Advent and Lent, the fiery red of Pentecost celebrating the Holy Spirit's descent, the pristine white for the joy of Easter and Christmas, and the somber black for funerals and masses for the dead. This wasn't arbitrary. It was a carefully orchestrated visual sermon that everyone, from the illiterate peasant to the learned scholar, could understand. By aligning your own clothing choices with this celestial schedule, you were performing a public act of piety, visually synchronizing your life with the rhythm of the Church. This created a complex set of unspoken rules for the laity. Wearing a garment of vibrant, celebratory red during the solemn, fasting period of Lent, for instance, could be seen as deeply disrespectful, a flamboyant disregard for the season's call to humility and reflection. It might earn you disapproving glances from your neighbors or, in a more zealous community, a sharp rebuke from the local priest. Conversely, choosing to wear simple, dark clothing during this time was a way to demonstrate your faith and communal solidarity without saying a word. The color green occupied a particularly ambiguous space in this spiritual landscape. While it could represent the renewal of life and was sometimes used in ordinary time, its deep roots in pre-Christian nature worship and pagan spring festivals never fully vanished. To wear a conspicuously green cloak might, in the eyes of a suspicious cleric, evoke echoes of the old religions, potentially marking you as someone who hadn't fully embraced the Christian faith or, worse, was dabbling in forbidden practices. This meant that a fashion choice could inadvertently become a theological statement, for better or worse. The moral symbolism assigned to colors further complicated daily decisions. The church taught that colors weren't just symbols, they could influence the soul itself. White was the color of baptismal innocence, a state to be protected. Black was the shade of sin and death, but also of the humility that could lead to redemption. Red held a powerful double meaning. It was the color of Christ's sacrificial blood and the martyrs who died for their faith, but it was also the color of the devil, of wrath, and of dangerous carnal passions. A knight might wear a red cross on his tunic as a crusader, proclaiming his holy mission, but that same red dye in a different context could be interpreted as a sign of a sinful or querulous nature. This gave every color a moral weight. Choosing your attire became a daily exercise in spiritual navigation, a way to project virtue and avoid the appearance of vice. For the average person, this was less about high theology and more about practical social harmony. Dressing in a way that aligned with church teachings was a way to avoid gossip, to show respect for your community, and to ensure you were seen as a good, orthodox Christian. In a world where your eternal soul was the ultimate priority, the color of your cloak was never just a fashion statement. It was a prayer, a protection, and a public declaration of where you believed you stood in the eyes of God. In the intricate dance of medieval fashion, the rules of the game changed dramatically depending on whether you were a man or a woman. The same society that dictated every shade and stitch based on class also enforced a rigid set of gendered expectations, creating two parallel but distinctly different sartorial landscapes. For women, clothing and color were often a reflection of the men in their lives, first their fathers, then their husbands. A noblewoman's wardrobe was a public display of her family's wealth and status, a walking advertisement for the power of her house. Because of this, she was often granted more leeway to wear visibly expensive, vibrant colors like rich scarlets, deep sapphire blues, and emerald greens. These hues showcased the financial ability of her male relatives to procure such luxuries, enhancing the family's prestige. However, this permission came with a crucial caveat. While the colors could be bright, the fabrics and cuts were heavily regulated to emphasize modesty and virtue. A sumptuary law might permit a merchant's wife to wear a crimson gown but forbid her from using silk or velvet to make it, ensuring her display of wealth was always tempered by a visual reminder of her prescribed morality and place. For men, the language of color was less about display and more about direct signaling of profession, rank, and authority. A man's place in the feudal or urban hierarchy was literally woven into his attire. The specific shade of his cloak or the trim on his tunic could instantly communicate his occupation. A lawyer or judge might be required to wear specific shades of sober black or dark blue to project seriousness and impartiality. Members of a specific guild, like the wool merchants or goldsmiths, might have a particular color associated with their livery, creating an instant visual identity for their trade brotherhood. For the nobility, the rules were about reinforcing their martial and political power. The colors they wore were less about family wealth displayed through them and more about their own personal authority and knightly status. This created a fascinating dynamic where a woman's colorful clothing spoke of her husband's success, while a man spoke directly of his own. This divergence meant that the risks associated with color were also deeply gendered. For a woman, the greatest danger was often perceived moral failure. Wearing a color that was too vivid, too expensive, or too alluring could easily attract accusations of vanity, pride, or even promiscuity. A noblewoman pushing the boundaries of fashion might be gossiped about as frivolous or arrogant, while a common woman wearing a brighter hue than her station allowed could be labeled as having loose morals or aspirations above her God-given place. Her sartorial power was a subtle, often dangerous tool for influence within the strict confines of her social role. For a man, the risks were more about professional and political failure. A knight wearing drab, common colors could be seen as lacking the vitality and wealth expected of his station, damaging his reputation and influence. A merchant wearing the deep purple reserved for royalty, however, wasn't just being vain. He was committing a direct and treasonous act of social climbing, challenging the very structure of authority. His misuse of color was a threat to the state, while a woman's was more often seen as a threat to the social and moral order. These rules reveal how medieval society used color to sculpt and maintain gender roles. A woman's identity was channeled through the controlled display of her family's status, her body a canvas for their prestige but always within the frame of modesty. A man's identity was a direct reflection of his own actions, his profession, and his power, with color serving as a badge of his place in the public hierarchy. Navigating this complex web required a sophisticated understanding of not just the law, but also the unspoken codes of honor, morality, and power that governed every thread in the medieval tapestry of life. From the moment a medieval child took their first breath, the world began dressing them for the role they were expected to play for the rest of their life. There were no onesies in cheerful, neutral colors. Instead, an infant's swaddling clothes were their first uniform, a tiny declaration of their family's place in the rigid social order. For the son or daughter of a noble lord, this meant being wrapped in fine linens and, as they grew, adorned in miniature versions of adult fashion. A young noble boy might wear a tiny doublet of rich kermes red, while his sister had a small gown of deep azure blue, colors that screamed of prestige and power long before the children could even speak their own names. This was a deliberate and constant visual education. Playing in a castle's great hall, surrounded by adults in similarly vibrant hues, these children absorbed a fundamental lesson. Their identity was intrinsically tied to these colors of privilege. They learned to associate their own bright clothing with comfort, authority, and their inherent superiority, a sartorial birthright that shaped their worldview from the very beginning. Conversely, the childhood of a peasant was defined by a palette of necessity. Their garments were crafted from coarse, undyed wool in its natural shades of brown, gray, or beige, or tinted with the most inexpensive dyes like walnut hulls or onion skins. These were practical colors meant to hide the dirt and grime of a life spent laboring in fields or tending animals. There was no need for sumptuary laws to restrict the children of the lower classes. Economic reality did that job with brutal efficiency. A young girl helping her mother with the washing at the riverbank would look up and see other children dressed just like her, in a sea of earthy, muted tones. For her, the lesson was equally clear but starkly different. Her clothing taught her about invisibility, manual labor, and a destiny that stretched no further than the boundaries of her village. The colors she wore were a daily reminder of her station, conditioning her for a life of deference and hard work, ensuring she understood her place long before she could challenge it. Yet, in this world of rigid visual stratification, there was one profound and universal exception: the christening gown. For this singular, sacred occasion, class distinctions were temporarily set aside. Every infant, whether born in a drafty castle or a smoky peasant hut, was wrapped in white. This was a powerful ritual, a visual representation of the Christian belief that all souls entered the world pure and equal in the eyes of God. For a brief moment, the child of a serf was adorned in the same color of purity and innocence as the child of a duke. This ceremony offered a fleeting illusion of equality, a hope that spiritual grace could transcend earthly hierarchies. But the moment the sacrament was over, the white gown was carefully stored away, and the child was returned to the colors of their station. The noble infant would transition to scarlets and blues, while the peasant child would slip back into their humble browns. This ritual made the return to the social order even more potent. It was a reminder that this equality was only spiritual and temporary, a glimpse of a heavenly world that starkly contrasted with the immutable class rules of the earthly one. The christening gown was not a challenge to the system, but rather a reinforcement of it, highlighting that even God's temporary grace could not alter the God-given social structure into which one was born. This early and relentless conditioning through color was one of the most effective tools for maintaining the feudal system. Children didn't need to be told they were different. They could see it in every interaction. A noble child, accustomed to their own vibrant attire, would come to expect deference from the children in drab clothing, internalizing their own social superiority as a natural fact. A peasant child, seeing the bright colors of the nobility from a distance, would learn to associate those hues with power and authority, a visual cue to lower their eyes and show respect. This psychological programming ensured that by the time they reached adulthood, these hierarchies felt innate and unchangeable, as much a part of the world as the sky above. The colors of their childhood cloaks didn't just predict their future, they actively constructed it, weaving the threads of social destiny into the very fabric of their identity from their earliest days. If you really want to understand how medieval people saw the world, you have to look at the stories they told and the images they created. Literature and art were not just for entertainment, they were the mirrors and the moral compasses of society, reflecting back its deepest values, its greatest fears, and its most rigid rules. And in these reflections, the colors of clothing were never accidental. They were a deliberate, powerful code used by artists and writers to instantly communicate who a character was, what they stood for, and the fate they might deserve. Take one of the most famous literary snapshots of the era, Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Chaucer was a master of this visual shorthand, painting his characters with their attire so that a 14th century reader would know them at a glance. The knight, the paragon of chivalry, is dressed in a fustian tunic that is still stained by the rust from his chainmail, a humble, practical, and unpretentious look that screams of his genuine martial virtue and his focus on deeds, not display. Then there's the merchant with his forked beard and his fashionable, multi-colored Flemish beaver hat. His entire appearance is calculated to project wealth and worldly success, the uniform of a man deeply invested in the cutthroat game of international trade. But the most famous example is the magnificent wife of Bath. She arrives on the pilgrimage riding a fine horse, wearing an elaborate headdress, and most notably a pair of scarlet red hose. That specific, vibrant color choice is a brilliant piece of characterization. It tells us everything about her. Red, as we know, was the color of passion, vitality, and expensive taste. For a wealthy, independent woman who had outlived 5 husbands and proudly discusses her own sexuality and autonomy, this bold fashion statement is a declaration of her confidence, her wealth, and her refusal to be confined by the demure expectations of her time. Through her red hose, Chaucer tells us she is a force of nature, both celebrated and controversial, long before she even begins her tale. This symbolic language was even more potent and unambiguous in the vibrant world of illuminated manuscripts and religious paintings. Here, the artists were working under the direct influence of the church, and their color choices were a form of visual theology, designed to educate and inspire a largely illiterate population. Saints and holy figures are almost always bathed in light and clad in the most precious, symbolic colors. The Virgin Mary is invariably wrapped in a magnificent cloak of ultramarine blue, a color so expensive it was literally made from crushed lapis lazuli gemstones. This was not just a pretty color, it was a direct representation of her role as the Queen of Heaven, her holiness and divine grace made visible through the most costly pigment an artist could use. Similarly, halos and heavenly backgrounds were rendered in brilliant gold leaf, symbolizing the divine light of God Himself, an unearthly radiance that no earthly fabric could ever truly replicate. This established a clear visual code for the faithful. Gold and celestial blue were the colors of virtue, divinity, and salvation. On the opposite end of the spectrum, artists used a palette of murky, dark, and unsettling colors to depict sin and villainy. Judas Iscariot, the archetypal betrayer, is consistently portrayed in lurid yellow robes, his garments visually branding him with the stain of treachery and jealousy for all eternity. Demons, evil spirits, and the torturers of martyrs are often painted in sickly greens, muddy browns, or sooty blacks, their very complexions and clothing marking them as corrupt and separated from God's light. These were not subtle suggestions, they were stark moral warnings. For a medieval person gazing upon these images in a church or a prayer book, the message was crystal clear. The colors you wore aligned you with either the forces of heaven or the legions of hell. It was a constant, powerful reinforcement of the sumptuary laws and social codes, teaching people that color choices had eternal consequences, influencing not just how society saw you in this life, but how God might judge you in the next. Beyond simple morality tales, this artistic code was also used to navigate complex social commentary. In the famous Tres Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, a breathtakingly detailed book of hours created for an immensely powerful French duke, the artist uses clothing to meticulously document the entire feudal structure. The Duke and his court are shown in their luxurious, colorful finery, deep reds, rich blues, and gleaming whites, engaged in aristocratic pursuits like hunting or feasting in majestic castles. Meanwhile, the peasants laboring in the fields below them are painted in dull, earthy tones of brown and gray, their practical clothing visually anchoring them to the soil they work. The artist isn't just depicting a scene, he is justifying and reinforcing the entire social order. The bright colors of the nobility are shown as their natural, God-given right, a crown of privilege, while the drab hues of the peasantry confirm their ordained place in the hierarchy. This artwork served as a potent piece of propaganda, assuring its elite owner that his world was as it should be, with every thread and every hue in its proper place. Through these literary and artistic lenses, we see that a cloak's color was never just fabric deep. It was a critical tool for storytelling, social control, and spiritual guidance, a vibrant language that shaped how medieval people understood their world and their place within it. But the true power of these color laws comes into stark focus not in the dusty pages of legal codes, but in the vivid, often chilling, stories of real people who dared to break them. These weren't abstract regulations, they were rules enforced with very real and very public consequences. Take the case of that 14th century Venetian merchant. Venice was a republic dominated by a powerful oligarchy of noble families, and they guarded their visual privileges with ferocious intensity. For a wealthy but common-born merchant to appear in public wearing a cloak dyed with even a hint of imperial purple wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was an act of political insubordination. The surviving court records tell a story of swift justice. The merchant was caught, humiliated, and hit with a crippling fine, a financial punishment designed not only to penalize but to serve as a very public warning to other ambitious commoners. His purple cloak was likely confiscated and destroyed, a symbolic annihilation of his pretensions. This was the system working as intended, instantly identifying a social threat and publicly crushing it, reinforcing the invisible walls of the class structure for all to see. Across Europe and England, the methods of enforcement could be even more creatively cruel. While fines were common, many sumptuary laws prescribed punishments designed to maximize public shame and ridicule. A commoner, perhaps a prosperous wool merchant's wife caught wearing a gown of aristocratic scarlet, might not just lose the garment. She could be sentenced to be paraded through the crowded market streets, forced to wear the offending dress inside out, or perhaps even stripped of it entirely, left exposed and humiliated before the very community she had sought to impress. The goal was psychological: to make an example of her, to transform her moment of pride into a lasting lesson in humility for everyone who witnessed her disgrace. This wasn't just about the color, it was about the audacity. Her crime was attempting to manipulate her social identity, to use fabric and dye to say something her birth did not permit her to say. The punishment was a brutal correction, a forceful reminder that identity was not something you could choose for yourself. Yet, for every story of punishment, there are tantalizing tales of those who skillfully manipulated this color-coded world to their advantage, turning the system's own rules into tools for survival or subversion. Consider the medieval spy. In a time of war or political intrigue, moving unseen through hostile territory was a matter of life and death. The smartest agent wouldn't choose a disguise of shadowy black, which might attract suspicion. Instead, they would adopt the ultimate camouflage, the invisible hues of the common folk. Donning a coarse, undyed brown tunic and a gray hooded cloak was like slipping into a crowd and disappearing. This attire signaled nothing: no wealth, no status, no allegiance. It was the uniform of the anonymous masses, allowing a spy to listen, observe, and pass through checkpoints without drawing a second glance. In this case, the humble, legally insignificant colors of the lower class became a powerful tool for those who knew how to use them. Perhaps even more daring were those who used color as a deliberate signal of rebellion. During the Great Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, or various urban uprisings in Flanders and France, the rebels needed a way to identify each other in the chaos of crowded streets and to present a unified front. They often chose specific colors or symbols to serve as their banner. There are accounts of rebels adopting green, the color of the common land they sought to reclaim from their lords, or wearing white as a symbol of their righteous cause. This was a breathtakingly bold act. They were taking the elite's own weapon, the power of coded visual identity, and turning it against them. By collectively adopting a color, they were no longer an anonymous mob. They were an army with an identity, using their attire to make a political statement that challenged the very foundations of the society that sought to control them. For these individuals, a cloak's color wasn't a marker of ordained status. It was a declaration of intent, a crown of defiance woven from the threads of rebellion. Beyond the rigid boundaries of law and the clear dictates of the church, there existed a more subtle yet equally powerful force governing the choice of a cloak's color: the medieval understanding of the human mind itself. People of this era did not see color as a passive decoration. They believed it was an active, almost magical force that could directly influence a person's emotions, their physical health, and their very moral character. This wasn't mere superstition. It was a deeply held psychological theory rooted in ancient ideas about the body's humors and the belief that visual stimuli could alter one's internal balance. A color was thought to emit a certain energy or vibration that could calm a troubled spirit, ignite a dormant passion, or even lead a soul toward sin. This belief transformed every colored garment from a simple statement into a potential tool for psychological manipulation, both of oneself and of everyone who looked upon it. Consider the color red, a hue that practically vibrates with intensity. Medieval thinkers saw red as a hot and dry color, directly linked to blood and fire, the very elements of life and destruction. It was believed that surrounding oneself with red or wearing it could literally heat the blood, stimulating courage, strength, and passionate love. This is why a knight might deliberately choose a red surcoat before a tournament or a battle. He wasn't just looking fierce, he was attempting to psych himself up, to tap into that wellspring of martial aggression and bravery that the color was thought to provoke. But this power had a dark and dangerous flip side. That same heated passion could easily curdle into uncontrollable rage, reckless violence, or sinful lust. A nobleman known for a volatile temper might find his reputation compounded by his preference for scarlet doublets, with people whispering that his choice of color was either causing or confirming his dangerous nature. Wearing red was therefore a psychological gamble. It could empower you with a crown of courage, or it could doom you by amplifying your worst impulses in the eyes of a watchful society. In direct opposition to red's fiery energy stood the serene and celestial power of blue. This was considered a cold and wet color, associated with the calm stability of the sky and the life-giving properties of water. To medieval eyes, blue had a profoundly calming effect on the mind. It was thought to cool fiery tempers, encourage patience, and promote truthful communication. This psychological association, combined with its link to the Virgin Mary, made blue the color of choice for those who wished to project an aura of peace, loyalty, and divine contemplation. A diplomat negotiating a tense truce might wear blue to encourage a calm and trustworthy atmosphere. A scholar deep in study might surround himself with blue tapestries to soothe his mind and aid his concentration. Where red shouted, blue whispered. Its power was not one of agitation but of pacification, offering a psychological crown of tranquility and moral clarity to those who wore it wisely. This belief in color's influence extended into the very practical realm of health and medicine. The doctrine of the four humors, which held that the body was governed by black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, was directly tied to this color theory. A physician might prescribe a specific color as part of a treatment. A person suffering from an illness believed to be caused by an excess of cold phlegm might be advised to wear red or sleep under red blankets, using the color's heat to restore balance to their body. Conversely, a patient with a fever, seen as an overheated condition of the blood, might be surrounded with cooling blue fabrics. This practice, known as chromotherapy, meant that your clothing could be perceived as a medical treatment or a health hazard. Wearing the wrong color for your perceived humoral imbalance might lead others to believe you were exacerbating your own sickness, making you an object of pity or even suspicion. All of this created an immense psychological burden on the individual making a sartorial choice. Selecting a cloak was not just about obeying the law or displaying wealth. It was about managing the perceived energy you are projecting into the world and inviting into your own life. A young man dressing for a court appearance had to ask himself, do I want to project the passionate energy of red, risking that it might be seen as aggression? Or do I opt for the trustworthy calm of blue, risking that I might appear too passive? A woman choosing a yellow gown had to contend with the color's dual link to joyous sunlight and to the treacherous stigma of Judas. Her choice could be seen as a celebration of happiness or an unconscious admission of a deceitful nature, depending entirely on the biases of those who saw her. This added a layer of profound social calculus to every decision. Your attire was a non-verbal cue that could predispose people to like or distrust you, to see you as a leader or a threat before you ever uttered a single word. In the high-stakes theater of medieval life, where first impressions could determine alliances, marriages, and conflicts, the psychology of color was a hidden weapon. A deep understanding of it could empower you to subtly manipulate a room, to put a rival at ease before striking a business deal, or to present yourself as the perfect, pious candidate for a coveted position. To ignore these unspoken rules was to risk being psychologically misread, misunderstood, and ultimately marginalized. Your cloak's color didn't just tell the world who you were. In the minds of your peers, it actively shaped who you were destined to become. Yet even with the strictest laws and the most profound religious teachings, there remained a layer of belief so deep and so pervasive that it could override all other concerns: the powerful, often terrifying world of superstition. For the vast majority of medieval people, the landscape was not just filled with lords and priests, it was alive with unseen forces, and the color you wore was like a beacon, either inviting their blessing or daring their wrath. This wasn't a matter of high theology or legal statute. It was the gritty, everyday reality of folk belief, a deeply ingrained system of omens and protections passed down through generations. In this worldview, a color was not a passive symbol. It was an active agent, a kind of magic that could shield you from harm or paint a target on your back for every mischievous spirit and malevolent gaze in the countryside. Consider the deep, shadowy green of the forest. For a nobleman hunting from horseback, this was the color of sport and mastery. But for the common traveler, the peddler walking alone down a wooded path, or the farmer returning home after dusk, green was a color of profound danger. It was the hue of the fairy folk, and these were not the gentle sprites of children's tales. They were ancient, capricious, and powerful beings who guarded their territories fiercely. To wear green while moving through their domain was seen as the worst kind of arrogance, a blatant provocation. You might be mistaken for one of them, inviting a challenge, or worse, you might be seen as flaunting your human presence in their world. The consequences were the stuff of nightmare: being led astray by will-o'-the-wisps into bottomless bogs, falling under a glamour that made you lose days or even years, or simply vanishing without a trace, your disappearance explained away with a knowing, fearful shake of the head. This belief was so potent that many would deliberately choose to wear muted browns or grays for a journey, not for humility, but for camouflage, hoping to slip past the notice of these otherworldly wardens unseen. In direct opposition to green's peril stood the protective power of white. While the church saw it as a color of purity, folk belief endowed it with a more practical, defensive property. It was thought to be anathema to evil spirits, ghosts, and witches. A white scarf, a linen shift worn under other clothes, or even just a few white threads woven into the hem of a cloak could act as a powerful ward. This was why a mother might insist her child wear a white ribbon when going out to play near the old, haunted mill, or why a bride might carry a sprig of white flowers not just for innocence, but to ensure no envious curse could spoil her wedding day. White was a shield, a portable circle of protection drawn in the language of color. This belief created a fascinating overlap between faith and folklore. A garment could be simultaneously a symbol of Christian virtue and a talisman against pagan evils, demonstrating how these belief systems blended seamlessly in the daily lives of ordinary people. The stakes for ignoring these unspoken rules could be devastatingly high. In a small, tightly knit village community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, an unusual choice of color could be the first step toward tragedy. A woman known for her knowledge of herbs, if she were also seen frequently wearing a deep, unusual red, might find that gossip slowly twisted her reputation from that of a local healer to a dangerous seductress, and from there to an outright witch. That splash of color could be presented as evidence of her pact with dark forces, a visual cue that confirmed the community's deepest fears. Similarly, a reclusive old man who favored a dark, mossy green might be blamed for a sudden blight on the crops or a mysterious illness in the livestock, his attire seen as proof of his connection to malign nature spirits. In an era before forensic science, when misfortune demanded an explanation, a person's clothing often provided the easiest and most visible culprit. An inauspicious color could be the spark that lit the fires of suspicion, leading to social ostracism, violence, or even a formal accusation of witchcraft before the authorities. This deep intertwining of color and superstition meant that getting dressed each morning was an act of spiritual and practical risk assessment. A person had to weigh the demands of the law, the expectations of the church, and the whispered warnings of local folklore. Would that new blue dye please the Virgin Mary but anger the water sprites believed to dwell in the nearby river? Would wearing red to the market attract desirable attention from potential suitors or undesirable attention from the evil eye? There were no easy answers, only a lifetime of accumulated wisdom and caution. This layer of belief added a final, unpredictable variable to the already complex equation of medieval fashion. It meant that personal safety could hinge on something as seemingly simple as the shade of your cloak, a daily reminder that the world was filled with invisible forces, and that every color choice was a message sent not just to your neighbors, but to the unseen world watching from the shadows. But just as a river carves a new path through ancient stone, the meanings of color in the Middle Ages were never frozen in time. They were a living, breathing language, constantly evolving with every new trade route, every technological breakthrough, and every seismic shift in the world around them. Imagine the impact of a single event like the Crusades. For centuries, European knights traveled east, and while their primary goal was military, they returned as unwitting agents of a cultural and commercial revolution. They brought back more than relics, they brought back knowledge. They encountered vibrant dyes and luxurious fabrics unlike anything seen at home. The deep indigo blues from the East that were far richer than European woad, or the complex dyeing techniques perfected in Byzantine and Islamic workshops. Most importantly, they encountered a different visual world, one where color held different power and prestige. This exposure didn't just introduce new hues, it fundamentally altered European taste. The stunning lapis lazuli blue used in sacred art, now associated with these sophisticated Eastern cultures, began its journey from a rare artistic pigment to a desirable color for aristocratic fashion, accelerating blue's ascent from humble to heavenly. This transformation was supercharged by tragedy. The Black Death of the 14th century didn't just decimate the population, it shattered the very foundations of the feudal system. With so many lives lost, a desperate labor shortage followed. Suddenly, the surviving peasants and artisans found their skills in unprecedented demand. They could negotiate for higher wages, and for the first time, a broader segment of society had disposable income. What did they spend it on? For many, it was a chance to partake in the visual world from which they had been excluded. They bought finer fabrics and more expensive dyes. This surge in demand from below, combined with the depleted ranks of the nobility who could no longer enforce the old rules as effectively, placed immense pressure on the sumptuary laws. The old visual order was breaking down. Legislators tried to respond with even more frantic and specific laws, but it was a losing battle. The genie was out of the bottle. A prosperous merchant's wife could now wear a shade of red that would have seen her publicly shamed a generation earlier. the lines were blurring, and with that blurring came both exhilarating new freedoms and terrifying new uncertainties. Technology, too, was a relentless driver of change. The late medieval period saw significant advancements in the science of dyeing itself. Dyers discovered new mordant chemicals that helped fix dyes to fabric, resulting in colors that were more vibrant and, crucially, more color-fast. A rich black, once nearly impossible to maintain without fading to a rusty brown, became a mark of sophisticated, expensive taste. The ability to create more consistent and reliable colors meant that the palette of available prestige expanded. It wasn't just about having access to a color anymore, it was about the quality and depth of that color. A new hierarchy based on the technical excellence of the dye job began to overlay the old hierarchy based solely on the dye source. This meant that even within a legally permitted color, there were now subtle gradations of status. A knight might wear a legally acceptable red, but if the dye was poorly fixed and looked faded next of a merchant's brilliantly fast scarlet, the knight could find himself visually upstaged on his own social turf. The goalposts of prestige were constantly moving. All of this flux created a social landscape that was far more confusing, but also far more dynamic than it had been at the start of the Middle Ages. For the wearer of a colored cloak, the late medieval period was a time of both incredible opportunity and heightened risk. On one hand, you had more freedom to express your wealth and identity through your clothing than ever before. A successful craftsman could now dress in a way that reflected his financial success, not just his birthright, but on the other hand, the rules were now murkier. With sumptuary laws still on the books but harder to enforce, navigating the social signals became a delicate and perilous dance. Was that new, deep violet you bought acceptable because everyone is doing it? Or is it just enough over the line to attract a hefty fine from a magistrate trying to reassert old authority? Was your choice to wear a particular shade of blue seen as stylish and devout, or as an arrogant appropriation of a symbol that wasn't yet fully yours to claim? The stakes remained high because the language itself was evolving in real time, and a misstep could still lead to social ruin. The story of color's evolution is a powerful reminder that history is not a static painting but a rolling wave, and the medieval men and women choosing their clothes each morning were riding the crest of that wave, trying to balance their aspirations with the ever-changing tides of law, technology, and tradition. And yet, we never truly left that world behind. The medieval rules may have faded from law books, but their echoes resonate in our modern lives in ways we often don't even consciously recognize. That subconscious power a color held 800 years ago to signal status, danger, or virtue is still operating on us today, a silent language programmed into our collective psyche. We see it every time we walk down a supermarket aisle. Why is a chocolate bar often wrapped in deep purple or gold? Because those are the colors of royalty, of exclusivity. The marketers are tapping directly into that ancient association between Tyrian purple and imperial power, whispering to our subconscious that this isn't just candy, it's a luxurious, regal experience worthy of a king. It's a crown for your wallet, a tiny, affordable piece of the prestige that was once literally worth more than gold. This historical inheritance is perhaps most visible in the traditions we hold most sacred. The modern white wedding gown is a perfect example. While it's often said that Queen Victoria popularized the trend in the 19th century, she was herself drawing on a much older medieval ideal. That sweeping, pristine white dress is a direct descendant of the medieval association of white with purity, virginity, and divine light. For a noblewoman in the Middle Ages, wearing a white gown for her wedding was a stunning display of wealth and moral virtue, a statement that she could afford such an impractical garment and that she entered the union with sanctity. Today, a bride might not be thinking about sumptuary laws, but she is participating in a centuries-old visual ritual, using that same color to communicate hope, new beginnings, and a certain idealized innocence. The tradition persists because the symbol remains powerful, but the legacy isn't always so positive or peaceful. The medieval use of color to mark and stigmatize marginalized groups casts a long and dark shadow. The yellow badges that Jews were forced to wear in so many medieval cities are a horrific precedent for one of the most infamous acts of the 20th century. The Nazi regime's order that Jewish people wear a yellow Star of David. The Nazis didn't invent this idea. They reached back into the darkest chapters of European history and weaponized an old, hateful symbol, understanding its power to isolate and dehumanize. Similarly, the concept of scarlet letters, used to shame individuals for moral transgressions, finds its roots in these same practices. While we no longer have laws enforcing such marks, the cultural memory remains. We might talk about someone being green with envy or warn against showing a yellow streak, idioms that directly descend from medieval color psychology. These phrases are fossils of an old belief system, reminding us that the language of color can still carry a sting. Even our modern professional and social uniforms are filled with these historical echoes. Think about the power suit in a boardroom. What color is it most often? Black, navy blue, or charcoal gray? These are the modern equivalents of the expensive, serious blacks and blues worn by the rising merchant class and nobility in the late Middle Ages. They aren't the flamboyant reds or purples of absolute power. They are the colors of sober authority, calculated trustworthiness, and understated wealth. They say, "I am serious, I am competent, and I mean business," much like a Burgundian duke using black velvet to project control. On the other hand, the bright red soles of a certain brand of high-heeled shoes are a brilliant modern manipulation of Scarlet's ancient message. They are a hidden flash of a once forbidden color, a secret signal of luxury and exclusivity visible only to those in the know, a subtle but potent crown for the wearer. So the next time you choose an outfit for a job interview, or pick out a gift wrapped in a specific color, or even react to a corporate logo, remember you are speaking a language that is centuries old. The stakes are thankfully no longer fines or imprisonment, but the principles are eerily similar. We still use color to navigate social hierarchies, to attract mates, to project confidence, and to form tribes. That little black dress, that power tie, that calming blue wall in a hospital, they are all part of a continuous conversation between the past and the present. The medieval world isn't a distant foreign country. It's the foundation of our own visual landscape, and understanding its rules gives us a remarkable power. It allows us to decode the hidden messages we are constantly sending and receiving, and perhaps to choose our own modern crowns with a little more wisdom and intention. So what does this all mean for us right here, right now, scrolling through our phones in a world of seemingly infinite sartorial choice? The story of the medieval cloak is far more than a historical curiosity. It's a masterclass in the psychology of perception, a centuries-old case study on how humans use visual cues to navigate their social world. And that is a lesson that is more relevant today than ever. We may not have sumptuary laws dictating our hemline length, but we are still constantly reading and being read by the colors we choose. Think about the last time you dressed for a video call, a first date, or an important presentation. You weren't just throwing on clothes, you were engaging in a modern form of that same medieval calculation. What does this color say about my credibility? Does this shade project the right kind of energy? Will this pattern make me seem more approachable or more authoritative? We are all, in a sense, still choosing our cloaks, and understanding this deep history makes us more conscious and therefore more powerful communicators. This awareness becomes a critical superpower in our globalized world. A businessperson negotiating a deal in China might learn that while white in the West signifies purity and is popular for weddings in many East Asian cultures, it's traditionally the color of mourning and would be a disastrous choice for a celebratory event. The vibrant saffron yellow, revered in India and parts of Southeast Asia for its sacred, spiritual significance, carries a completely different weight than the cautionary yellow of a Western traffic light or the dated connotations of 1970s interior design. The medieval traveler had to navigate the color codes of different duchies and kingdoms. We have to navigate the color codes of entire continents and cultures. Understanding that a color is never just a color prevents missteps and builds bridges, transforming our wardrobe from a simple collection of fabrics into a toolkit for respectful and effective cross-cultural connection. Perhaps the most profound takeaway from this journey through history is a renewed appreciation for the sheer freedom we now possess. The ability to walk into a store and buy a shirt of any color, any hue, without fear of legal reprisal or social ostracization, is a privilege forged through centuries of struggle against those very restrictions. The sumptuary laws of the Middle Ages were ultimately a failure. They were an attempt to legislate identity, to freeze a social hierarchy in place through fabric and dye. Their eventual collapse, accelerated by plagues, revolutions, and the relentless force of human ambition, paved the way for the expressive individualism we enjoy today. Every time we dye our hair a bold magenta, or wear a brightly colored suit to the office, or simply choose an outfit that feels authentically us, we are, in a small way, celebrating a victory over those who once believed our place in the world should be determined by our birth and visually enforced by our clothing. Yet, for all our hard-won freedom, it's fascinating to see how we've created our own modern, informal sumptuary laws. There are no penalties for breaking them, but the social consequences can be very real. Consider the unspoken dress code of a Silicon Valley tech CEO, the uniform of a black turtleneck, jeans, and sneakers popularized by figures like Steve Jobs. This is a deliberate rejection of the traditional power suit, but it's also a new code. It signals a different kind of status, one based on innovation, disruption, and a casual confidence that doesn't need to rely on traditional markers of authority. Similarly, the fashion choices within different subcultures, the goths' embrace of black, the preppy aesthetics' reliance on pastels and navy blue, are all ways of visually identifying tribe members and signaling belonging. We have traded government-mandated codes for a complex ecosystem of social signaling, proving that our innate human desire to use clothing to communicate our identity is as strong as it ever was in the Middle Ages. Ultimately, the story of color empowers us to be more intentional architects of our own image. It invites us to move beyond simply following trends and to ask ourselves a more meaningful question: what do I want my chosen colors to say about me today? Do I want to project the serene trustworthiness of blue in a tense meeting, the creative, energetic vitality of yellow for a brainstorming session, the sophisticated authority of black for a formal evening? History has shown us that these choices carry weight. They influence first impressions, affect moods, and shape narratives. By understanding the deep roots of color symbolism, we reclaim that power. We can choose to align with traditions, or we can choose to subvert them and create new meanings entirely. Our clothing is our canvas, and the palette is now ours to command. The medieval person's cloak was a predetermined label. Our cloak is a statement we get to write for ourselves, a daily opportunity to crown our own identity with intention and purpose. Throughout this exploration, we've uncovered how the color of a medieval cloak was far more than a decorative choice. It was a determinant of destiny, woven into the very fabric of society through laws, beliefs, and economics. From royal purples to stigmatized yellows, each hue carried weighty implications, capable of elevating individuals to greatness or casting them into peril. These historical lessons remind us of the profound power of symbolism in human culture and the enduring impact of visual identity. As we reflect on this vibrant past, consider how color influences your own life today and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining this journey into medieval history. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights into the fascinating tapestry of our shared